The millionaire returned home unexpectedly early from his business trip, intending to pleasantly surprise his daughter. However, the moment he opened the door to the little girl's room, he was instantly stunned to find the newly hired tutor engaged in this alarming activity. The sleek, dark luxury sedan glided smoothly before coming to a stop outside the ornate wrought iron gates of Mansion No. 1 in the exclusive Polanco neighborhood. The mid-afternoon sun on this Friday was intense, reflecting dazzlingly off the asphalt, but inside the vehicle, the air remained cool and controlled. Alejandro Vega stepped out, adjusting the crisp cuff of his shirt. He glanced at the Patek Philippe watch on his left wrist, 3 days early. For the first time in 2 years, he'd concluded a deal ahead of schedule. His chauffeur hurriedly circled the car, ready to retrieve the leather suitcase. Alejandro raised a hand, signaling him to stop. "No need, Carlos. I've got it. You can take the rest of the day off." In his right hand, he clutched a gift box wrapped in clear cellophane. Inside was a muñeca Lely doll with bright, colorful ribbon braids, a traditional handcrafted item that his daughter Sofia had pointed out in a magazine the week before. He had missed her school recital, and the doll was his overdue apology. The heavy oak front door swung inward, making barely a whisper of sound. Absolute silence permeated the vast foyer. There was no sound of the piano playing Cielito Lindo, as was typical every afternoon. No clatter from the household staff, only the dry, solitary tap of Alejandro's leather dress shoes hitting the marble floor echoed. He placed his hand on the banister leading to the second floor. A thin film of dust clung to his fingertips. Alejandro frowned, rubbing his fingers together. This minor lapse in order was completely out of sync with Camila's famously impeccable standards for managing the household. A churning knot of unease began to form in his stomach, more unsettling than any motion sickness he had felt on the plane. Alejandro quickened his pace. The stairs seemed to stretch into an endless climb. He headed toward Sofia's room at the end of the hallway. The door was slightly ajar. He was about to push it open, the rehearsed smile already spreading across his face. But the smile instantly vanished. Instead of the gentle lavender fragrance he usually associated with her room, a pungent, sour smell, the unmistakable odor of stomach acids, assaulted his nostrils. Thud. The doll box slipped from Alejandro's grasp, hitting the hardwood floor. The cellophane wrapping split open. In the center of the room, Elena, the tutor who had started just last week, was kneeling on the floor. Her hair was pulled back haphazardly, a few strands matted to her sweat-soaked forehead. One hand supported Sofia's forehead, while the other was firmly and rhythmically patting the child's back. "Let it out, sweetheart. Push it out. You can do it." Sofia was hunched over a small blue plastic basin. The little girl's frail body, swallowed by her oversized pajamas, convulsed with each dry heave. A thin, pale pink fluid dribbled from her mouth, staining the plush carpet. A surge of fiery indignation rushed to Alejandro's head. Acting purely on instinct, he lunged forward like a sudden squall. "What in the world do you think you're doing?" Alejandro violently swept Elena's hand away from his daughter. The force of the push made Elena lose her balance, sending her stumbling into the edge of the bed frame. Deprived of support, Sofia staggered, nearly pitching face first into the basin. Alejandro quickly caught her, pulling her close to his chest. Her small body was burning hot like a furnace, radiating heat through his thick suit jacket, yet her hands were icy cold and pallid. Elena instantly scrambled back to her feet, ignoring the sharp pain in her shoulder. She rushed forward, attempting to assist Sofia again, her eyes blazing with urgent concern rather than fear. "Don't hold her so tightly. Her stomach is still spasming. If you restrict her like that, she could suffer aspiration into her lungs." "Get away from her," Alejandro roared, clutching his daughter tighter. "What poisonous concoction did you give her to eat?" Sofia clung desperately to the lapel of his expensive suit jacket. Her tiny, bluish-tinged fingers fiercely scratched at the costly fabric. Her large eyes were dull, darting around but not focusing on him. She seemed to be staring into the empty space behind his back. "Daddy," Sofia's voice was a ragged whisper, fractured and weak. "My tummy," spiders. They're biting me. It's so hot. I'm here, Mika. I'm right here. Alejandro frantically stroked her hair, her sweat soaking his palm. There are no spiders. I'm taking you to the hospital right now. She made me eat bitter candy. Sophia mumbled incoherently, tears welling up in the corners of her eyes mixing with streaks of saliva at her mouth. Alejandro spun around to face Elena, his eyes flaring with accusation, as if ready to consume her whole. Do you hear that? What did you do to my little girl? Elena was momentarily stunned, opening her mouth to explain, but before she could utter a single word, the small body in Alejandro's arms suddenly went rigid. Sophia arched her back, curving tautly like a drawn bow. Her eyes rolled back, leaving only a frightening expanse of white. Her breathing came out in a long, ragged gasp, then abruptly faltered and went silent. The child went completely limp, her hands dropping down, losing consciousness entirely in her father's trembling embrace. A deathly silence descended upon the room, broken only by the frantic drumming of Alejandro's heart against his ribs, threatening to burst through his chest. Alejandro scooped Sophia up, sprinting down the staircase, leaving the odor-filled room far behind. Elena's bare feet pounded against the hardwood floor as she raced right behind him, her hands still reaching out, trying to stabilize the child's drooping head. Carlos opened the car door. Now, Alejandro's shout ripped through the silence of the garden. The elderly chauffeur startled, dropping his unfinished pastry, and quickly yanked open the rear door of the Rolls-Royce. Alejandro dove into the back seat, settling Sophia gently into his lap. He furiously slammed his foot against the glass partition separating the driver and passenger compartments. Santa Fe Hospital, go forget the traffic lights. The car roared to life like a wild beast, the tires screeching against the pavement before it rocketed forward. Elena didn't have time to properly get into the back. She scrambled into the front passenger seat. Before she could buckle her seatbelt, the sharp swerve at the first intersection sent her body violently swaying. Elena twisted completely around, reaching through the gap between the seats. Her fingers found Sophia's thin wrist, and her eyes were glued to the little girl's frail, fluttering chest. Her pulse is racing. You need to keep her head tilted to one side. We can't risk any fluid getting into her lungs. Alejandro obeyed instinctively, but his eyes, when they met Elena's, were full of cold suspicion. He brushed a clump of sweat-drenched hair off his daughter's forehead. Suddenly, Sophia's body jerked. Another convulsion seized her. "Sophia, my baby, Daddy's here." Alejandro frantically patted her cheek, his hand shaking uncontrollably. "What is happening to her, Carlos? Step on it." "Don't pat her cheeks," Elena exclaimed urgently. She grabbed a tissue from the car's console box and handed it to Alejandro. "Wipe the excess saliva from her mouth. That seizure is likely due to an electrolyte imbalance." Alejandro quickly wiped his daughter's mouth, the sticky texture and sharp, unpleasant odor making his stomach clench. He needed to know what she had consumed. Only by knowing the cause could the doctors effectively help her. His trembling hand pulled his phone from his inner jacket pocket. He tapped the contact labeled "Wife Dear" on the touchscreen, his finger slipping twice before he managed to unlock it. He put the call on speakerphone and tossed the device onto the adjacent seat so he could use both hands to firmly hold Sophia's flailing legs. The waiting tone stretched out endlessly. Then, a serene sound answered. The gentle melody of a bamboo flute mixed with the babbling of water from a meditation track, creating a jarring contrast with the blare of car horns and the roar of the V12 engine cutting through the air on the highway. "Hello," Camila's voice answered, petulant and sleepy, followed by a long yawn. "I'm in the middle of a seaweed face mask, Alejandro. You know my Friday afternoon spa rules. What's so urgent that you're calling right now?" Alejandro practically screamed into the phone, tears already blurring his vision. "Sophia is in the emergency room." "What did you give her for breakfast this morning? Answer me now." Silence hung on the other end for several seconds. The meditation music continued to flow inopportunely. "Calm down, darling." Camila's voice suddenly became clearer, but instead of alarm, it carried a tone of defensiveness. She was perfectly fine this morning. I gave her oatmeal cereal like every other day, and then I left at 10 o'clock. She was watching cartoons and giggling then. Oatmeal wouldn't make her become so violently ill like this. Alejandro snarled, his grip tightening on his daughter's shoulder as another mild spasm rippled through her. Why are you yelling at me? I've looked after her for 2 years. Nothing like this has ever happened. Camilla's voice rose, punctuated by the rustle of a turning magazine page. Ah, did the new tutor arrive? That Elena woman. Elena, who was gripping Sophia's wrist, froze at the mention of her name. She looked up sharply at the glowing phone. She arrived just as I was leaving. Camilla continued, her tone shifting to one of haughty disdain and sharpness. You know how poor people are. They feed children all sorts of rubbish. Street food, cheap candy. Who knows what she brought into our house? Elena was momentarily speechless. She opened her mouth to object, but her throat tightened. She was sitting in a multi-million-dollar car, her clothes disheveled, her low social standing contrasting sharply with the accusation leveled by the privileged mistress of the house. She looked at Alejandro, hoping for a moment of fair judgment. Alejandro stared intently at Elena. His expression changed. The initial panic slowly gave way to a dark suspicion. Camilla had a point. Sophia had been stable for 2 years. Elena had only been here a week. And today, the moment he returned, he found Elena right next to his daughter's discomfort. Alejandro hung up the phone abruptly without another word to his wife. He wrapped his arms around Sophia, turning her face into his chest, her back toward Elena. It was a primal protective gesture, shielding his child from the perceived danger sitting in the front seat. Don't touch her again. Alejandro's voice was low and icy cold. He didn't look up at Elena. Elena withdrew her hand and slumped into the seat, her hands tightly clasped. A feeling of helplessness and isolation washed over her, far more terrifying than the insane speed of the car. The Rolls-Royce skidded to a stop right in front of the emergency entrance of Santa Fe International Hospital. The automatic doors of the hospital entrance swung wide. A team of doctors in white coats and nurses pushing gurneys rushed out like a swarm, converging on the black car. Alejandro burst out, placing Sophia onto the gurney. Save my daughter. Please, save her. The clatter of the gurney wheels against the tiled floor, the doctor's urgent commands, the rapid sound of running feet. Elena rushed out of the car, intending to follow, but a nurse's hand stopped her at the glass doors. The doors to the emergency room slammed shut in front of her, swallowing Alejandro and Sophia whole, leaving Elena standing isolated in the frigid hallway under the stark white fluorescent lights. The emergency room doors closed, dividing the hospital hallway into 2 separate worlds. On one side, life struggled precariously amidst the beeping of machines. On the other was a suffocating, silent wait. The red indicator light above the doorway glowed vivid and painful, like an open wound. Alejandro couldn't sit still. He paced the stark white hallway, his leather shoes hitting the cold tiled floor with dry, repetitive thuds. He gripped the expensive Hermes silk tie he had just ripped from his neck, crushing it in his sweat-soaked palm. In the furthest corner of the hallway, Elena leaned against the wall. She crossed her arms over her chest, her fingers digging into her biceps to suppress the tremors spreading through her body. The strong smell of hospital disinfectant triggered old professional memories. She closed her eyes, trying to rewind the recent images. The seizure, the excessive saliva, the pink-tinged distress. This was not typical food poisoning from spoiled food. That usually causes diarrhea before the onset of distress. Sophia's distress was immediate, and her nervous system had been severely stimulated. The door flew open. Dr. Mendoza, the chief of internal medicine, stepped out. He pulled down his mask, revealing a face etched with weary lines. Alejandro lunged forward, nearly colliding with the doctor. How is my daughter? Is she awake yet? Dr. Mendoza didn't answer immediately. He looked at Alejandro, then glanced at Elena, standing discreetly in the corner. He sighed, handing Alejandro the test results clipped to a folder. We have stabilized the seizures. But Mr. Vega, I need you to see this. Alejandro took the paper, his eyes quickly scanning the dense medical terms and numbers. He didn't understand all the jargon, but two lines highlighted in red by the doctor immediately jumped out at him: retinol, vitamin A, and caffeine. Dr. Mendoza pointed to the two readings, explaining, "She is suffering from acute liver toxicity. Her vitamin A level is 15 times the acceptable limit, and the caffeine concentration is equivalent to an adult consuming 10 shots of espresso in quick succession. For an 8-year-old child who is already malnourished, this is a lethal dose. Her kidneys are severely overloaded." Alejandro snapped his head up, his eyes wide with astonishment. "What are you saying, caffeine, vitamin A? She's only 8. She doesn't drink coffee, and I have never given her an overdose of supplements. Our family only eats organic food." "The lab results do not lie," Sir Dr. Mendoza stated gravely, his gaze sharpening. "A large amount of these substances was introduced into her system within a short period, likely in the last few days. We need to know precisely what liquid or medication she consumed to administer the correct liver detoxifying agent. Any delay could result in permanent liver damage." The sharp click of high heels on the tile floor broke the tension. Camilla appeared from the elevator. She wore a figure-hugging cream silk dress that highlighted her model physique, with a designer handbag casually slung over her shoulder. The heavy scent of Chanel perfume wafted overpowering the clinical smell of alcohol and antiseptic in the emergency area. Camila glided to her husband's side, completely ignoring Elena. She snatched the test results from Alejandro's hand. "What did the doctor say?" "What's wrong with her?" Camilla's sharply lined eyes quickly scanned the paper. When she saw the word caffeine, she gasped dramatically. "Oh my God, caffeine, I knew it." Camilla spun around, her red manicured finger pointing directly at Elena's face. "It was you. It has to be you." Elena flinched, taking a step forward. "What are you talking about? I didn't." "Don't deny it." Camilla shrieked, her voice echoing down the hall and drawing the attention of the nurses at the desk. "You wanted her to be alert so you could cram knowledge into her, didn't you? Did you give her energy drinks or black coffee? I read articles all the time about tutors forcing stimulants on students to achieve high grades. I am a nurse. I know how dangerous caffeine is for children. Don't you dare slander me." Elena retorted, her voice trembling with fury and indignation. Camila immediately covered her face, sobbing dramatically and leaning into Alejandro's shoulder. "Alejandro, look at her. I told you not to hire strangers." My poor Sophia. She was healthy this morning, and the moment this woman arrived, the baby is like this. She must have secretly mixed it into the child's drink. Alejandro stood between the two women. On one side, his wife of 2 years, always poised and seemingly knowledgeable. On the other, the impoverished tutor employed for only 7 days. He looked at the lab results. Caffeine, the stimulant used for alertness. Camilla's accusation, though monstrous, sounded eerily plausible. He recalled the sight of Elena aggressively trying to expel the contents from his daughter's stomach earlier. Was she trying to dispose of the evidence in the child's system? The fragile trust Alejandro had momentarily placed in Elena completely collapsed. He gently detached himself from his wife, then took a long stride to stand directly in front of Elena. His tall frame cast a shadow over the young tutor, creating a suffocating pressure. "Explain yourself. Why is there caffeine in my daughter's system?" "Mr. Vega, please think clearly." Elena looked him straight in the eye despite her fear. "I have no motive. I genuinely care for Sophia." "Don't talk about affection here." Alejandro dismissed her words, his voice as cold as a razor blade. "I don't pay you to care for her. I pay you to teach her, and now she's in there with a failing liver." He pointed toward the emergency exit. "You are not to come within 100 yards of this room. The police are on their way. If you cannot account for the source of that poisonous concentration, you will spend a long time in prison for aggravated assault on a minor." Elena took a step back, her back hitting the cold wall. She was literally backed into a corner. Camilla stood behind her husband, giving Elena a look of contemptuous satisfaction, before turning back to play the distressed mother for the doctor. Elena looked over Alejandro's shoulder. Doctor. Mendoza was urgently waving down a nurse. Time was running out. He needed the family to sign consent forms for a blood filtration procedure. If she stayed here to argue, she would lose, and worse, Sophia might not receive the right treatment. She took a deep, steadying breath, suppressing her pride and fear to the pit of her stomach. She needed to act. Mr. Vega. Alejandro turned back his gaze full of disdain. Elena didn't back down. She looked him straight in the eyes, her gaze so resolute that it made Alejandro pause for a second. You can hand me over to the police right now, but that will not save Sophia. The doctor needs to know exactly what she drank, the brand, the ingredients to administer the antidote. She pointed toward the elevator. Give me 1 hour. Allow me to return to your house. I will find the evidence. Why should he trust you? Are you planning to go back and destroy the evidence? Camilla interjected sharply. If I don't find the substance she consumed within 1 hour? Elena cut her off, her voice firm, every word dropping onto the hospital floor with conviction. I will willingly hand myself over and accept every charge you place against me, without a single word of complaint. Alejandro narrowed his eyes at the small woman before him. He saw the desperation of someone betting everything they had, and her only asset right now was her freedom. Alejandro stood like a statue in the hallway, his gaze fixed on the small glass window of the emergency room door. Inside, Sophia was lost amidst a tangle of medical wires. Dr. Mendoza tapped the tip of his pen against the medical chart, the clicking sound indicating his impatience. Mr. Vega, I need a decision now. Broad-spectrum blood filtration will be invasive and carries high risks for the child. If we know the precise toxin, we can use a milder neutralizing agent. Are you certain there are no unusual bottles or medication containers at home? Alejandro raked his hands through his hair, destroying his normally impeccable appearance. He turned to Camilla, his eyes pleading with desperation. Do you remember where she might hide snacks? Or if you bought any new drinks for the refrigerator? Camilla was sitting in the waiting chair, scrolling through her phone. At her husband's question, she merely shrugged her eyes, never leaving the glowing screen. How should I know if she hid something? Only God could find it. And I told you this is definitely that Tutor's doing. Just interrogate her, and you'll get the whole truth. The sheer indifference in his wife's response sent a chill down Alejandro's spine. He was a millionaire. His bank account held countless zeros. He could afford to buy the entire hospital. But at this moment, his money was useless. Money couldn't buy information about what his daughter had consumed while he was away. A heavy, suffocating sense of helplessness engulfed him. I will find it. Elena's voice broke through the stalemate. She stepped forward from behind, blocking the view of the hospital security guard who was about to approach and apprehend her as per Camilla's earlier demand. Elena didn't look at Camilla nor the guard. She looked straight at Alejandro. In her mind, she was reviewing her night shifts in the pediatric ward 3 years ago. She remembered children admitted for accidental adult medication ingestion. Sophia's specific tremors, the neurological agitation, and the faint artificial strawberry scent she had noticed in the vomit while administering first aid. This wasn't the smell of energy drinks. Energy drinks have a sharp citrusy acid smell. This scent was sweeter, softer, like candy. Elena pulled her worn wallet from her purse and took out her national ID card. She placed it firmly on the nurse's desk right next to the test results. This is all I have. My identity, my address, and my freedom. I'm staking it all. She turned to Alejandro, her gaze unwavering. Mr. Vega, let me go. I know what I need to look for. I know the habits of children who are, she almost said starved, but caught herself, lonely children. They will look for anything appealing to eat. Alejandro looked at his daughter's tiny hand twitching faintly on the hospital bed through the glass. Then he looked at the sheer determination in the eyes of the poor Tutor. He had been in the business world for 20 years. He knew how to read people. Liars usually avoid eye contact. Elena was looking at him as if she were ready to walk into a fire. He nodded, a decisive nod that accepted the risk. Carlos. His trusted chauffeur and bodyguard stepped forward. Alejandro pulled the car keys from his pants pocket and tossed them to the man. Take her home. Monitor her every movement. Do not take your eyes off her for half a second. If she tries to bolt, Alejandro paused, his voice dropping to a menacing tone. You know what to do. Understood, boss. Carlos caught the keys mid-air. He turned to Elena, saying nothing, his large, powerful hand grasping her upper arm like a vice. Let's go, Tutor. Don't make me use force. He ushered Elena toward the exit. His manner was rough and decisive, as if escorting a genuine criminal. Elena didn't resist. She gritted her teeth against the pain, her steps quickening to match the bodyguard's long stride. The hospital's automatic doors opened. The humid, late-afternoon heat of Mexico City hit her face, a stark contrast to the chilling, lifeless atmosphere inside the emergency room. The blare of car horns and the noisy chatter of the outside world felt like a bucket of cold water, reminding Elena of the harsh reality. She had 60 minutes. Elena jumped into the back of the Rolls-Royce. Carlos slammed the door shut immediately, engaging the child safety lock to ensure she couldn't jump out. Elena leaned back into the plush leather seat, but her heart was pounding in her chest as if it would burst. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. Calm down, Elena. You're a nurse. You must use logic. The child didn't eat regular food. The refrigerator must be the key. But if not food, then what contains caffeine and vitamin A and smells like strawberry? Hold tight. Carlos's voice was cold and detached from the driver's seat. The car roared. The powerful V12 engine propelled the car forward, merging into the heavy traffic on Paseo de la Reforma. The car weaved through the slowly crawling lines of vehicles, beginning a breathless race against the specter of tragedy looming at the hospital, carrying the last fragile hope of a child clinging to life. The Rolls-Royce Phantom screeched to a halt, leaving a long black tire mark on the steaming asphalt under the oppressive afternoon heat of Mexico City. Before the iron gate of the Vega mansion had fully opened, the car squeezed through the narrow gap, raced into the courtyard, and stopped with a violent lurch. Elena didn't wait for the car to fully stop. She flung open the door, shooting out like an arrow. Her old sneakers pounded on the cobblestone pavement, propelling her in a desperate sprint across the vast, meticulously manicured garden. "Hey, wait up!" Carlos's shout echoed behind her. The large bodyguard took long strides to pursue her, his heavy footsteps thudding on the ground like a sledgehammer, but Elena didn't look back. The only sound in her mind was the frantic beeping of the heart monitor in the emergency room. 60 minutes. She only had 45 left. The heavy oak front door was flung wide open. Elena raced into the great hall. The eerie silence of the immense house swallowed the ragged breathing and hurried footsteps of the two adults. She ran straight upstairs, plunging into Sophia's room. The room was filled with pastel pink and expensive plush toys. But Elena ignored them. She darted to the study desk, grabbing the small Hello Kitty trash can. She inverted it onto the floor. Only a few scraps of paper and pencil shavings tumbled out. No candy wrappers, no snack bags, no trace of any junk food. Elena frowned. If a child suffers from dietary distress, it's usually because they hide spoiled food or questionable snacks in their room. But this trash can was disturbingly clean. She rushed to the playroom next door, yanking open cabinets, overturning boxes of Lego toys. Empty. Just toys and storybooks. Not a single cookie crumb. Carlos was now blocking the doorway, his breathing steady despite the long run. He tapped his index finger against the face of the military-style watch on his left wrist. 15 minutes are up, Tutor. You're wasting my time and the boss's. If you can't find anything, we're going back to the station. Elena didn't reply. She stood in the cluttered room, sweat streaming down her collar. Why was it so clean? An 8-year-old child with her father away and a stepmother who didn't care would usually take advantage of the opportunity to snack freely. But Sophia didn't. Unless the child had nothing to eat. The thought flashed through Elena's mind like lightning. She spun around, squeezed past Carlos, and thundered down the stairs, heading straight for the kitchen. The Vega Mansion's kitchen was the size of Elena's entire old apartment. The stainless steel appliances gleamed, reflecting the afternoon sun, cold and detached. The glossy black marble countertops were spotless. Elena rushed to the enormous four-door Sub-Zero refrigerator that dominated one wall. She yanked the door open. A blast of cold air hit her, carrying the sharp scent of fresh vegetables and the faint raw smell of uncooked meat. What met Elena's eyes was an almost obsessive level of perfect organization. On the top shelf were dozens of bottles of celery and kale juice labeled with Camilla and specific consumption times. Next to them were pre-portioned containers of salad consisting only of greens and a few slices of cherry tomato. The lower shelves held rock-hard marinated chicken breasts, salmon fillets, and prime cuts of tenderloin beef. All raw ingredients that required elaborate preparation before consumption. Elena frantically searched the refrigerator door shelves where snacks are typically kept. Nothing. She pulled out the crisper drawers, only carrots, cucumbers, and broccoli. She opened the freezer, pure ice cubes and low-fat matcha ice cream, a flavor children typically detest. The sheer emptiness of the refrigerator struck Elena powerfully. No fresh milk, no string cheese. No fruit yogurt, no ready-to-eat hot dogs, no custard, or anything an 8-year-old could easily grab and consume when hungry. This refrigerator was not set up for a family with a child. It was the dietary storage unit of a weight-obsessed model. Father's away. The housekeeper is on leave, as Camilla said on the phone earlier. The stepmother spends her days at the spa and her evenings at parties. What would an 8-year-old who doesn't know how to cook eat? She would fast, or she would eat whatever looked remotely edible. Elena slammed the refrigerator door shut. The loud thud echoed harshly in the silent kitchen. She turned to face Carlos, her eyes blazing with a fury that made the large bodyguard momentarily flinch. "You people starved her!" Carlos frowned, confusion clouding his face. "What are you talking about? The fridge is full of food, Wagyu beef, Norwegian salmon." "That is raw food," Elena yelled, pointing at the closed refrigerator door. "Does an 8-year-old know how to turn on this industrial gas range to pan-sear Wagyu? Find me 1 carton of milk. Find me 1 cookie." There's nothing Sophia wasn't intentionally harmed. She was starving amidst this pile of gold. Carlos fell silent. He looked at the refrigerator, then at the modern gas stove with its dozens of complex knobs. He was beginning to grasp the gravity of the situation. He pulled out his phone, intending to report the situation to Alejandro. But Elena didn't wait for his sympathy. She scanned the kitchen once more. If there was no food, what did Sophia eat that caused the caffeine and vitamin A overload? Her gaze suddenly caught a small object rolling around in the far corner of the kitchen island, hidden behind the professional coffee maker. A crystal glass. Elena quickly walked over. The glass was completely dry, but a thin, pale pink powder residue clung to the bottom and sides. A few tiny, undissolved red grains were stuck at the base. She picked up the glass. She brought it close to her nose. The cloyingly sweet scent of artificial strawberry assaulted her. But immediately after, a sharp, faintly bitter medicinal odor hit her trained senses. It wasn't the smell of juice, nor was it the smell of typical candy. Elena narrowed her eyes. This smell, she'd encountered it before. The smell of sugar-coated pills, the smell of deception. She placed the glass down hard in the sink. The ringing sound of glass against porcelain echoed sharply. "I know where it is." Elena didn't offer Carlos an explanation. She shot out of the kitchen like a gust of wind, her feet pounding back into the great hall and up the stairs to the second floor. But this time she didn't turn left toward Sophia's room. She turned right, heading for the elaborately carved double doors of the master bedroom, Alejandro and Camilla's private domain. "Hey, where are you going?" Carlos shouted, his long legs striving to catch up. He was ordered to monitor her, but Elena barging into the owner's bedroom was a severe trespass. "Stop right there. You are not allowed in there." Ignoring the shouting behind her, Elena slammed the bedroom door open. It was unlocked. A heavy, cloying scent immediately hit her, making Elena dizzy and sneeze. It was a chaotic mix of Chanel perfume, expensive scented candles, and layers of heavy makeup powder. The room was vast and opulent, yet surprisingly disorderly. Elena rushed to the dressing table by the window. It was a large table cluttered with hundreds of bottles and jars of all sizes and colors. "Get out of here right now," Carlos had caught up, standing breathlessly in the doorway. "If anything is missing in here, you couldn't pay for it with your life." Elena ignored the threat. Her hands swept a pile of gold necklaces and eyeshadow palettes aside. Her eyes darted, constantly searching for a specific color. Pink. Red. Something that smelled like strawberry. Not this, not that. The afternoon sun streamed through the sheer voile curtains, illuminating a corner of the table obscured by a tissue box. A small glimmer of light reflected back. A clear glass jar with a metallic gold lid. Elena snatched it up. The jar was labeled in a cute looping English font, "Gummy Bears, Skin and Shape." Inside the jar were tiny gummy candies shaped like small bears, vibrant red and bright pink. They looked delicious, appealing, and as harmless as any candy sold in a supermarket. Elena turned the jar in her hands. She quickly scanned the ingredients printed in tiny font on the back, serving size 2 gummies per day. Warning: keep out of reach of children. Ingredients: high-potency retinol, concentrated vitamin A, green tea extract, caffeine extract, Garcinia cambogia, appetite suppressant. A cold dread washed over Elena. High-dose vitamin A for skin clarity and beauty, caffeine and an appetite suppressant for weight loss. The jar was more than half empty. The lid was screwed on loosely and crookedly, suggesting it had been opened and closed multiple times in a hurry. Elena unscrewed the lid. The overwhelmingly sweet artificial strawberry scent wafted out, identical to the smell in the glass downstairs and the odor in Sophia's distress. She took out a red gummy bear. She brought it to her mouth, biting off a minuscule piece from the ear. First, the intense sweetness of the outer sugar coating melted on her tongue. The fragrant strawberry flavor fooled her taste buds. But after just 3 seconds, when the sugar dissolved, a sharp, bitter, medicinal taste surged up, clinging to her throat, making Elena instantly shudder and want to spit it out. She spat the candy piece into a tissue on the table, quickly wiping her mouth. She looked at the candies in the jar, then pictured Sophia. An 8-year-old child, her stomach rumbling with hunger because the refrigerator was empty. The child found this jar of candy. She ate one, sweet, tasty. But then the bitterness set in. A normal child would spit it out. But Sophia was starving. She would try to swallow it. She would eat a handful, 5-10 pieces, to fill her empty stomach. Elena gripped the jar tightly, her knuckles white. She turned back to look at Carlos. The bodyguard was standing frozen in the doorway. He had witnessed Elena's entire sequence of actions, finding the jar, reading the label, tasting it, and spitting it out with a grimace. He looked at the jar in Elena's hand, then into her eyes. In that moment, the blind loyalty of an employee gave way to the conscience of a human being. He understood what had happened. He slowly lowered the phone in his hand. He took a step back, yielding the path to Elena. "Take it." Carlos's voice was low and hoarse. "We have to save the child." Elena nodded. She shoved the jar into her purse, preparing to exit the room and race back to the hospital, ending this nightmare. But just then, a sound broke the silence. The high-pitched, steady electronic beep of an alarm resonated from the far end of the hallway. The sound cut through the silence of the house, clearly audible. Elena froze. Her feet felt rooted to the floor. She recognized that sound. It wasn't a phone alarm. It was the preset reminder tone on an old electronic device she had once seen Sophia secretly using under her study desk. Elena spun around, dashing back down the hallway. She chased the sound like a lost sailor finding a lighthouse in a storm. It led her back to the pink-themed room at the end of the hall, Sophia's room. Carlos ran right behind her, his heavy footsteps echoing rapidly. He was no longer trying to stop her. Elena burst into Sophia's room. The beeping was coming from under the bed. She didn't hesitate, dropping to her knees on the hardwood floor. Dust clung to the knees of her jeans, but she paid it no mind. In the darkest corner, obscured by a box of old toys, a faint blue light was blinking. Elena reached her hand in. Her arm scraped painfully against the bed frame. Her fingers touched a cold metal object. She grabbed it, pulling it out. It was an old generation iPad, its edges scuffed and a long crack running diagonally across the screen. This was likely an outdated device Alejandro had discarded and given to his daughter rather than buying her a new one. On the illuminated lock screen, the reminder notification popped up along with the alarm tone. Time to record your vlog. Sophia Elena silenced the alarm. The room fell silent save for the heavy breathing of her and Carlos. Open it. Carlos stood behind her, his voice low and urgent. Elena swiped the screen. Password. 4 digits. She paused for a second. She didn't know the password, but then she remembered the student profile she had read over and over before her interview. Sophia's birthday. 1, 2, 0, 8. The virtual lock on the screen clicked open. The home screen appeared featuring a picture of Sophia and Alejandro at the park taken long ago, when she wasn't as frail as she was now. Elena didn't open the browser or games. Her heart clenched as she saw the list of photo albums. No pictures of trips or parties, only hundreds of video thumbnails in an album labeled Sophia's Diary. All the thumbnails featured only one main character, Sophia, and the setting was always the same. Sophia alone in her room, Sophia alone in the kitchen, Sophia alone in the garden. A child growing up with a camera lens instead of her parents' presence. Elena's trembling fingers scrolled to the most recent video. The time displayed, yesterday 0:30 a.m. She took a deep breath and pressed the play button. She turned the volume up to maximum. Carlos knelt beside her, his eyes fixed on the cracked screen. The video began with a rustling sound, the image shaking violently as Sophia struggled to prop the tablet up against a cereal box on the kitchen counter. Sophia's face filled the frame. Under the natural light of the kitchen, her emaciation was even more pronounced. Her eyes were shadowed, her cheekbones high, and her lips cracked and dry. She was wearing an oversized t-shirt, the collar slipping down to reveal a fragile collarbone. Hi everyone, Sophia's voice rang out, trying to sound cheerful like the young YouTuber she watched, but her tone was weak and breathless. Welcome back to the Sofia Vega channel. Today is Friday and I'm in Daddy's super huge kitchen. Sophia turned her head toward the kitchen door, then whispered to the camera, "Shh, talk quietly. Okay, Mommy Camilla is sleeping." She locked her room door. I knocked to ask for breakfast, but she said she had a headache and couldn't be disturbed. The child carried the camera around the kitchen, opening the empty cabinets. Chef Pablo is on vacation. Maria the helper is also out of town. Daddy is away on business. My tummy is protesting. Listen. Sophia pressed her flat abdomen close to the tablet's microphone. A long, distinct rumbling sound echoed, the sound of a completely empty stomach spasming in vain. Elena brought her hand to her mouth, stifling a choked sob. She felt like someone was squeezing her heart. On the screen, Sophia climbed onto a tall stool, reaching up to the kitchen island counter. But it's okay. Look, everyone, I found treasure. Sophia held up to the camera the exact glass jar Elena was carrying in her purse. Gummy bears, skin and shape. These are Mommy Camila's candies. Sophia's eyes lit up a heartbreaking, innocent hope. Mommy said if you eat these, you'll lose weight and be as pretty as a model. I don't need to lose weight, but I want to be pretty. Sophia unscrewed the lid, pouring the red gummy candies into her small palm. If I'm pretty, Daddy won't go on business trips anymore. He'll stay home and play with dolls with me. Do you think so? The naive question hung in the still air. No one answered the child. Only the profound loneliness echoed back from the 4 cold walls. Sophia raised the handful of candy to her mouth. You can all eat with me. She shoved the entire handful of candy into her mouth, chewing frantically. Immediately, her face crumpled, her eyebrows knitted together. It's so bitter. Sophia grimaced, clutching her throat, coughing violently. It's not sweet like regular gummies. It tastes like medicine. She tried to spit it out, but then her eyes looked into the camera looking at her own reflection. No spitting. I have to eat it to be pretty. Come on, Sophia. Sophia closed her eyes and swallowed hard. She grabbed another handful from the jar, continuing to put them into her mouth. 2 pieces, 3 pieces, 5 pieces. The concentrated doses of caffeine and vitamin A were being consumed by the depleted body of an 8-year-old child, all in the name of beauty and a desperate desire for affection. The video ended abruptly as Sophia clutched her stomach, her face pale, and collapsed onto the counter, accidentally knocking the camera over. The screen went black. Elena let her hand drop. The tablet slipped from her grasp, lying still on the hardwood floor. Hot tears streamed down Elena's cheeks, soaking the sleeve of her shirt. She wasn't crying out of fear anymore. She was crying out of pain. She was weeping for the extreme loneliness of that child. The little girl was being destroyed by neglect, by hunger, and by a craving for her parents' love so profound that she was willing to swallow those bitter pills. Carlos stood up. He backed up a few steps, leaning against the wall. The bodyguard's usual cold, impassive face was gone. In its place was sheer horror. He was a father too. He looked at that dark screen and saw the cruelty of the very employers he had served for so long. What? What have we done? Carlos's voice was raspy. Elena sprang to her feet. She violently wiped her tears with her sleeve, her movements sharp and forceful. Her eyes burned with a fire of righteous indignation. Gone was the fear of the poor tutor. Now she held the truth. She stuffed the tablet and the jar into her purse, zipping it shut tightly. Let's go, Elena commanded, her voice cold but weighted with immense gravity. Take me back to the hospital. Immediately. Carlos nodded quickly. He no longer treated her like a prisoner. He ran for the door, even faster than Elena. I'll drive as fast as I can. Hold on tight. Elena followed Carlos, racing down the stairs. Each step she took on the floor sounded like a war drum. She was carrying the evidence of cruelty disguised under the opulent facade of the elite. The Rolls-Royce once again cut through the wind as it sped out of the Vega Mansion gate. This time, it carried more than just hope. It carried a storm that was about to break over Santa Fe Hospital. Santa Fe International Hospital was still submerged in an atmosphere thick with antiseptic smells and anxiety. But that stillness was shattered when the automatic doors at the main lobby flew open. Elena charged in. Her hair was messy, sweat-matted strands plastered to her forehead. Her white uniform shirt was stained with dust from under the bed and was heavily wrinkled. Carlos was right behind her. He raised a hand signaling the hospital security guards who were about to approach and restrain Elena due to her disheveled appearance. Clear the way. Let her pass. The loud command from the large bodyguard made the crowd part like the Red Sea. Elena headed straight for the waiting area outside the emergency room. Alejandro was still sitting there on the hard blue plastic chair. He was slumped forward, his head buried in his hands, presenting the picture of a powerful man completely drained of strength. His expensive suit jacket was crumpled, his tie tossed to the side. Hearing the familiar rush of footsteps, he snapped his head up. In the chair opposite him, Camilla sat with her legs crossed, holding a small mirror to touch up her slightly faded lipstick. She seemed oblivious to the intensity of the situation, or perhaps she was deliberately ignoring it with her usual vanity. Elena offered no greeting. She walked straight to the low glass table between the couple. She reached into her purse and pulled out the Gummy Bears skin-and-shape glass jar. Clatter. She slammed the jar onto the glass tabletop. It spun a few times, the red candies inside rattling against each other before it settled right in front of Camilla. The loud noise made Camilla jump. What the heck? Camilla hissed, quickly wiping her cheek with a tissue. Are you crazy? Do you want to break this table? Elena didn't answer. She braced her hands on the table, leaning forward, her fiery gaze boring into Alejandro, compelling him to look at the evidence. Read it, Elena said, her voice hoarse, but every word clear. Read the ingredients out loud. Alejandro looked at the jar. He reached out and picked it up. The glass was still warm from Elena's hand. He turned the label toward him. The English words jumped out: high-potency retinol. Green tea extract caffeine, appetite suppressant. Alejandro's face went from confusion to utter disbelief. High-dose vitamin A, caffeine, and diet pills. He looked up at Elena, then at his wife. "This is," Elena pointed at the jar in his hand. "The doctor said Sophia has vitamin A and caffeine in her system. This is the source. Not an energy drink, not coffee. It's diet medication." Alejandro whipped around to face Camila. He held the jar up to her face, his hands beginning to tremble. "Camila, what is this?" Camila glanced at the jar. She immediately recognized the familiar item from her vanity table, but instead of fear or remorse, she merely frowned, clicking her tongue in annoyance. "Oh, so this is where that jar went." Camila shrugged her tone, chillingly casual. "I've been looking for it all morning. I thought the maid threw it away." "So the little brat stole it?" "Did she stole it?" Alejandro repeated, his voice cracking with astonishment. "You're saying she stole it?" "What else? I kept it on my vanity. In my private room. If she sneaks in, takes it and eats it, she has to face the consequences. I told you that child has sticky fingers. She probably thought it was tasty candy and secretly indulged. Gluttony leads to tummy aches." What's so strange about that Camila's reply, her apathy, her chilling casualness, and her outright blaming of an 8-year-old child fighting for her life, caused the surrounding space to freeze. The nurses at the desk stopped typing. Other relatives of patients turned around to stare, their eyes focused on the beautiful yet emotionless woman with undisguised disgust. Alejandro looked at his wife. For the first time in their 2 years together, he felt like he was looking at a complete stranger. No worse than a stranger. He was seeing a monster hidden behind a mask of makeup and silk dresses. Gluttony Alejandro repeated the word, his voice low and dangerous, like the growl of a wounded animal. "You're saying my daughter's overindulgence caused this outcome." "Don't be so dramatic," Camila snapped, closing her compact with a sharp click. "It's just a few diet gummies. She'll regain balance after she clears her system. Next time I'll lock my cabinet better." "Is that enough?" Her heartless response was like a slap in the face to Alejandro, washing away every illusion of the happy family he had tried so hard to build. He realized that he had entrusted his daughter to a woman who had no soul. The rage he had suppressed for too long erupted in Alejandro's chest. But Elena spoke first. "You say the child was being greedy." Elena's voice rang out, cutting through Alejandro's impending outburst. She stood up straight, looking at Camila with a mix of pity and contempt. "Do you think the child ate that incredibly bitter medicine because it was delicious?" Elena slowly reached into her purse again. She pulled out the cracked tablet. "Mrs. Camila, did you ever stop to wonder why the refrigerator in your house is full of nothing but greens and detox water? Did you ever stop to wonder what an 8-year-old child would eat when you locked your door and slept until noon?" Elena placed the iPad on the table, turning the screen toward Alejandro. "Watch this, Mr. Vega. See how your daughter indulged herself." Elena's finger pressed the play button. The video began to play. The static-tinged sound from the external speaker blared out, but Sophia's young, isolated voice was perfectly clear, piercing through the hospital noise, stabbing straight into the hearts of the adults standing there. The air in the Santa Fe hospital hallway felt compressed in a tightly sealed box, so suffocating that the hum of the air conditioning unit on the ceiling seemed painfully loud. Elena placed the cracked tablet on the glass table, situated precariously between Alejandro and Camila. She said nothing more. All words were superfluous, now weighed down by the gravity of the truth. Her thumb, still bearing a trace of dust from under the bed, firmly pressed the triangular play button. Static, static. The distorted sound from the speaker rang out, tearing through the heavy atmosphere. Alejandro, who had been slumped over, looked up at the sound. His eyes were bloodshot, strained from exhaustion and worry. He stared at the screen. The moment Sophia's voice began, Alejandro's entire body went rigid, as if he'd been jolted by electricity. It wasn't the cheerful, playful voice she used when video calling him to ask for gifts. It was a young, fragile voice like smoke, but containing a dense, precocious loneliness. "My tummy is protesting again, everyone. Mommy Camila is asleep with her door locked." Alejandro leaned forward, his hands pressing hard against the cold glass table. He stared intently at the shaky image on the screen. He recognized his kitchen. He recognized the modern refrigerator he had spent thousands of dollars on, and he saw his daughter standing in front of it, small, dwarfed, desperately searching for a morsel of food. Camilla, who had been casually filing her nails moments before, froze. The crystal nail file hovered in midair. She glanced at the screen with initial annoyance, as if someone had put on a terrible song. But when she heard her name mentioned alongside the loud rumbling of Sophia's stomach, the half-smile on her face vanished. The sound from the video continued, seeping into every corner of the hallway, searing into the minds of everyone present. The patter of Sophia's bare feet on the hardwood floor, the clinking sound of the medication jar opening. Alejandro held his breath. He watched his daughter holding the gummy bears jar. The child's eyes in the video were bright, not from the craving for candy, but from a painfully innocent, blind faith. "Mommy said eating these makes you pretty. If I'm pretty, Daddy will come home and play with me, right?" That naive question escaped the static speaker hung in the air, then dropped onto Alejandro like a 1,000-pound boulder. Time seemed to stop. Alejandro felt his chest rip open, his heart, the strong muscle that had helped him navigate the cutthroat business world for 20 years, now shattered into 1,000 tiny pieces. He didn't see a greedy child. He saw a child trying to buy her father's love by tormenting herself. She wasn't eating because she was hungry. She was eating because she thought she wasn't good enough, not pretty enough to keep her father home. She was swallowing those bitter pills to swallow the loneliness that he and Camilla had created. On the screen, Sophia's face crumpled as she chewed the chemical-laced candies. So bitter. But I have to try. Her coughing, her choked sobs as she forced the bitterness down her throat, all merged into the most devastating indictment of Alejandro's conscience. Alejandro's knees buckled. He couldn't stand any longer. The tall, powerful man slowly slid from the chair, collapsing onto the cold, tiled floor. His hands gripped the edge of the glass table, his knuckles white, shaking violently. Tears streamed from his deep-set eyes, splashing onto his polished leather shoes. What have I done? He had spent his life building skyscrapers for others, only to let his own daughter fade away in his own home. Camilla sat beside him, paralyzed. The crystal nail file dropped to the floor with a small clink, but in her ears it sounded like a death knell. She looked around. The atmosphere in the waiting area had changed entirely. The nurses at the desk had stopped working, standing up and staring intently in their direction. Other patients' relatives were whispering and pointing. The looks directed at Camilla were no longer admiration for her designer dress or Hermes bag. They were looks reserved for something repulsive, grotesque, the judgmental gaze of society reserved for a wicked stepmother from a fairy tale. But this was the real-life version, infinitely more brutal and cold. Camilla felt a cold tremor run down her spine. The thick layer of makeup couldn't hide the pallor of her skin. She wanted to stop the video to smash the tablet, but her limbs were rigid, unable to move. The video ended with the screen going black as Sophia collapsed. Silence returned, but this time it carried a lethal weight. Alejandro still knelt there, head bowed. His shoulders shook with every suppressed sob. Camilla swallowed hard, her throat dry. She knew she had to say something. She had to defend herself. She had to turn the situation around. She was the victim of a misunderstanding. Yes, just a misunderstanding. Alejandro. Camilla's voice was weak and trembling. You can't believe that video. Kids are so dramatic these days. That tutor probably put her up to recording it to extort us. The clumsy, cowardly lie slipped from Camilla's mouth, a natural reflex of someone who had never known how to admit fault. Alejandro slowly raised his head. His movement was slow, heavy, as if he were carrying the weight of a collapsed world. He turned to look at his wife. His tear-streaked face no longer showed distress. It had transformed. His eyes, usually warm and yielding to his wife's demands, were now dark, deep, and as cold as an abyss. He looked at Camilla. He saw the perfect makeup. He saw the meticulously manicured nails. He saw the selfishness, the indifference, the cruelty wrapped in silk. Every memory rushed back to him. The times Camilla complained about Sophia being a nuisance. The times she refused to cook, afraid of damaging her nails. The times she lied that the child had eaten well so he could travel without worry. And climaxing with that damn jar of gummy bears. The trust, the love, the respect he had for this woman was utterly annihilated, turning to ash at that very moment. Alejandro stood up. His figure towered over her, eclipsing the neon lights, casting a dark shadow over Camila. He reached out, snatching the glass jar from the table. "Be silent." Alejandro's roar resonated like thunder, shaking the entire hospital hallway. He swung his arm violently, throwing the jar onto the floor. Crash! The ear-splitting sound of shattering glass filled the air. The jar exploded. Sharp shards of glass flew everywhere. The pink and red gummy bears scattered across the floor, rolling beneath everyone's feet like congealed drops of illness, like silent accusations. Camilla screamed, shrinking back in her chair, covering her face with her handbag, terrified of being hit by flying glass. Alejandro took a step forward, grinding the candies under his shoes. He bent down, bringing his face close to Camilla's. The hot breath of his fury washed over her, threatening to melt her makeup. "You say she was acting." His voice was a dangerous hiss. "Look at those test results. Her liver is about to fail. Her kidneys are exhausted. You call that acting? I didn't mean to." Camilla stammered, tears starting to flow, smearing her mascara. "I just wanted what was best for her. I thought..." "You thought what?" Alejandro cut her off, his eyes filled with repulsion. "You thought she was a doll you could toss aside when you were bored. You thought I married you so you could turn my house into a prison where my daughter was starved." He straightened up, looking down at the trembling woman at his feet as if she were refuse. "I was blind." Alejandro said, his voice suddenly terrifyingly calm. "I was blind to believe you could be a mother. I was blind to believe you loved her. But thank you, Camilla. Thank you, because this poisonous candy has finally opened my eyes." He pointed straight toward the hospital's main exit. His hand was steady, his index finger straight as an arrow, not trembling in the slightest. It was the gesture of a man who had regained his authority and clarity. "Get out of here." Alejandro calmed down. "Let's go home and talk." Camilla tried to stand up, reaching for his sleeve. Alejandro snatched his arm back, stepping away. "Which home?" He smiled faintly, a bitter and painful expression. "That house was never yours. It belongs to my daughter, and you have permanently forfeited the right to ever step inside it again." He turned to Carlos, the bodyguard, who was standing stunned in the corner, still reeling from watching the video. "Carlos." "Yes, boss." Carlos stepped forward, his posture rigid. "Escort this woman out of here, and ensure she never comes within 100 meters of me or my daughter. If she dares to approach, call the police and have her arrested for child endangerment." "Understood, sir." Carlos stepped in front of Camilla. He no longer held his usual deference. His face was cold and impassive. "Please leave, madam. Don't make me use force in front of all these people. It wouldn't look good for your lady title." Camilla looked around. The eyes of the crowd felt like thousands of poisoned darts aimed at her skin. No one was sympathetic. No one was defending her. She looked at Alejandro one last time, hoping to find a flicker of hesitation in her husband's eyes. But there was nothing. Only the coldness of a stone wall. Camilla understood that everything was over. Her career as a millionaire's wife, the extravagant parties, the shopping trips without looking at price tags, all vanished with the shattered gummy bears on the floor. She bit her lip until it bled, grabbed her purse, and stumbled to her feet. She kept her face down, trying to hide her crushing humiliation, and quickly walked past the crowd that parted for her as if avoiding a curse. The frantic clicks of her high heels on the hospital floor were like nails being driven into the coffin of her own conscience. Alejandro stood there watching his former wife's retreating back until she vanished behind the revolving door. He felt no triumph, only emptiness and pain. The storm of anger had passed, leaving behind a father with a scarred heart. He turned, looking toward the closed emergency room door. Inside was the only world he had left, and this time he swore he would protect it with his life, never allowing anyone, including himself, to cause it harm again. Camila gritted her teeth. She violently snatched her Hermes bag from the chair, her nails scraping the expensive leather. Her eyes darted around, looking for an escape route from the encircling, contemptuous gazes. Fine, Camila hissed, throwing her chin up at Alejandro, trying to salvage the last shred of her dignity. You think I need this miserable family I'm leaving? You can hug your sick child and live your life. She spun around her high heels, clicking loudly with resentment, heading straight for the exit. But before she could take 3 steps, 2 figures in dark blue uniforms appeared, blocking her path. They were 2 police officers. They had been standing there since Elena started the video, quietly observing and taking notes. Doctor Mendoza had followed the mandatory protocol, immediately reporting suspected child vulnerability to the authorities. Mrs. Camila Vega. The police chief stepped forward, his voice firm, his hand resting lightly on his belt. Camila froze, her face draining of color. She backed up, bumping into a nurse's station. What? What do you want? I am Mrs. Vega. Get out of my way. You are under arrest for conduct resulting in harm to a minor's well-being and deliberately causing physical distress to another person. The officer pulled out a shiny set of restraints from his holster. We have sufficient evidence from the medical tests and the video recording. What? Arrest me? Camila shrieked. She spun around to face Alejandro, her arrogance gone, replaced by utter panic. Alejandro, what are you doing? Tell them to stop. I'm your wife. You're a millionaire. You can buy them off. Do something. Alejandro stood still as a stone monument. He looked at the woman screaming hysterically, his eyes devoid of any pity. He remembered the image of the frail Sofia chewing the bitter medication in the video. He slowly walked closer to the police officer. Alejandro Savmi. Camila lunged, trying to grab his arm, but the officer quickly restrained her, pulling her arms behind her back. Click. The cold sound of metal echoed dryly. The restraints locked tightly onto Camila's manicured wrists. Alejandro looked down at his wife, his voice low and cold like a judge's verdict. I can use my money for many things, Camila. And I will use my money to hire the best lawyers to keep you in prison for as long as possible. That is the last thing I will ever do for you as your husband. You bastard, I curse you. Camila struggled, screaming obscenities as the 2 officers dragged her roughly down the hallway. The crowd parted. No one offered sympathy, only weary headshakes for a poisonous beauty. Camila's shrieks faded, finally silenced after the police car door slammed shut outside, returning a semblance of calm to the hospital. Alejandro let out a long, shuddering breath, his shoulders slumping. The storm had passed, but the wreckage it left in his heart was vast and desolate. He turned around. Elena was leaning against the wall, clutching the purse filled with evidence. She looked exhausted, her hair disheveled, but her eyes shone with relief. Alejandro walked up to her. He bowed his head low, an action the lifelong pride of the construction king had never performed before a subordinate employee. Thank you, his voice was shaky. Thank you for not abandoning her. Thank you for being braver than I was. Elena offered a gentle smile, a kind expression that erased the class divide between them. Don't thank me, Mr. Vega. Go inside. Someone is waiting for you. And this time, don't bring any gifts. Just bring the heart of a father. Alejandro nodded. He adjusted his collar quickly, wiped away the last streaks of tears on his cheeks, and pushed the door open to the hospital room. On the stark white bed, amidst a complex web of IV lines, Sofia lay still. Hearing the sound, she opened her eyes. Her large eyes were confused, still haunted by fear. Daddy. That weak call tightened Alejandro's heart. He rushed to the bedside, kneeling down on the floor so his eyes were level with hers. He took her small, cold hand, pressing it to his cheek. I'm here. I'm right here, Micha. His voice cracked. I'm so sorry. I came home too late. Where is Mommy Camila Sofia? Whispered nervously, glancing toward the door. Is Mommy mad because I ate the candy, Daddy? I'm sorry. No. Alejandro shook his head fiercely, tears falling onto the bedsheet. No one is mad at you. The wicked witch is gone. There will be no more bitter candy ever again. Never. He turned to the bedside table. Carlos had managed to bring up a hot bowl of chicken congee from the cafeteria. Alejandro lifted the lid. The simple, comforting scent of rice chicken and scallions wafted out, banishing the cold smell of antiseptic. Are you hungry? Let's eat a little, okay? Sofia nodded. Alejandro picked up the plastic spoon. The hands that had signed billion-dollar contracts now trembled clumsily, scooping a small spoonful of congee. He held it up, blowing on it carefully, afraid of burning his daughter. He brought the spoon to her mouth. Open up, my girl. Sofia obediently opened her mouth, swallowing the warm congee. The warmth spread down her empty stomach, soothing the painful spasms of the past few days. A weak but radiant smile, like morning sunlight, bloomed on the little girl's cracked lips. Is it good, sweetheart? Alejandro asked, anxious, as if awaiting the verdict of his life. It's so good, Sofia whispered, her eyes crinkling. Daddy's congee is 100 times better than Mommy Camila's candy. It's not bitter. It's so sweet, Daddy. The innocent remark made Alejandro break down into loud sobs. He buried his head in his daughter's hand, his shoulders shaking. He realized that for 2 years he had been busy building towers for others, but he had left his own home desolate. He had tried to use money to buy happiness, but all his child needed was a hot bowl of congee and his presence. Elena stood outside, looking through the window glass. She saw the father clumsily feeding his daughter and the smile of the child who had just escaped a dangerous predicament. She smiled content and pulled her jacket tighter. Her mission was complete. She turned and walked away down the hospital hallway. Outside, the vibrant sunset was descending upon Mexico City, painting the streets gold. Tomorrow would be a new day. A day without the candy of loneliness, but only the warmth of a real family meal.